Thank you, Carolyn, for your comments about manufacturing. A couple things here. When you talk about energy, and you were mentioning that as one of the assets, for this region, natural gas happens to be a good, large, consistent source of energy. So this is one of those natural resources that we are abundant in this region that makes us very competitive. But over the overall capacity, because of the size of our state, and we've been talking about the merger for quite a while here, and because of the capacity, because of the ability to make more investments, that's where I have a little bit of a concern about the state and remaining competitive on the energy side for manufacturing. You made a comment about the silver tsunami. I've done this a little bit at the center to look at this. We've talked about a lot of manufacturing, and you can see a previous recording on our website, but manufacturing here and the senior levels with skills, I mean, the deep skills in those senior levels here are much further along. I mean, they are past the retirement age and they're staying around. So when you're talking about senior tsunami at the U.S. level, it's even more significant here in the manufacturing. There's a lot of issues going on to that one. And I want to make one more comment because this wasn't the Q&A. I just had to make some comments to this. Another one you made is the machinery. I think it's fascinating on some of the machinery and equipment that we've added into manufacturing. It's not just aerospace, and there really was like 2 cycles of adding equipment within aerospace here. One right when we get in the recession, and then again recently where some of that equipment already was obsolete or they had to add on to it. So there's some unique things there. But there's also added machinery in western Kansas. And things like that meat processing, you might have seen some of the news where it was very labor intensive. And then all of a sudden they found out how to add more technology on the transportation side, on the inside of that meat processing. So we've been adding a lot more machinery within the state in the multiple sectors we have. So it's some neat stuff going on there. Before I get into talking about the overall fabric and what's going on in manufacturing, let me give you first our outlook of Kansas. Now, our outlook for Kansas is employment. The one on the left shows that employment growing essentially by 0.1% or essentially flat this next year. Right? I have a problem when we talk about the population and labor supply that we're going to be able to actually have that matching and growing forward. So that's almost zero growth. Now, I think you can just look at that gray bar there, or the gray range. What could make it grow a little faster? The optimism we heard this morning was there, right? The global economy and national economy could push some of that up. Maybe there will be some spillovers more than we expected in agriculture, but I just don't really expect that to happen in the short run. Maybe in 19, but I don't really expect a lot in this shorter run what's going on. On the downside, notice we do have a negative in our forecast. The downside is we continue to have problems with labor. We continue to have problems in some of our core sectors, and we have a little decline. Now, I'm giving a pretty gloomy forecast, but let me put this in context. The reality is households in Kansas are feeling better than they have ever felt before. We are at full employment in here. So not only we're at full employment, we have employers aggressively going after other employees, giving them increases in wages. And so households do not see what I'm talking about. Businesses are also not seeing what I am talking about either. They're feeling pretty optimistic as well. So let me go a little further in, and we'll continue to explain why I'm a little bit more gloomy about our outlook. When you look at the larger cities across the state, I think they're going to continue to grow. They're just not going to grow as fast because of the weighing down of the slowing of the state economy. Some of the ag issues and oil issues are going to weigh down some of those cities. When you look at the cities in the state, Kansas City MSA is likely to grow the fastest. They've been adding skilled jobs and they've been attracting skilled labor to that market, and I think they're going to continue to grow. Topeka, which was actually not doing so well in previous years, we've gotten past the state austerity measures. We're also looking at a manufacturing component there in the food manufacturing because the U.S. consumer is going to continue to grow. So I think Topeka is actually going to pick up some growth this next year. As for Wichita, we're settling down into this slower growth of 0.4%. Now let me put this also in context. Wichita has still never came back to our previous peak in employment. We're still not there. Now, a lot of it has to do with structural issues in our economy. Some of it has to do with this labor issue also in the Wichita area, which is slowing down some of our growth. So is 0.4% positive? Absolutely. I think this is where we've been growing. So if you're a company and you said last year was decent, this next year is going to be decent as well. If you think last year is good, I think this next year you're going to see it is feeling pretty good. But on the employment side, I don't see a lot of expansion and employment in the Wichita area in our forecasts. Now let me get to manufacturing. And let me explain this one graph. The gold bars shows the level of employment in 2016, and the hollowed out ones show the annual change in employment over the last 5 years. You look at this, what's the biggest sector still? You see transportation equipment, mostly aerospace, yet it's declined. Look at the total employment, move over to the text. Manufacturing's been declining in Kansas for quite a while. Now, my daughter is getting to the age where she's thinking more about boys and wanting to date. And this is a lot like the dating scene. She's seen a couple bad boys, and then she thinks they're all bad. And that's not the case. There are actually a lot of really good sectors, and there's really good information or really good things going on in a lot of our manufacturing sectors. So we shouldn't just count all of it out just because we've been continuing to decline in this manufacturing within the state. So before I get to some of the good, let me give you a little bit of update on this aerospace. And unfortunately, it's going to sound like a broken record. And I know you've seen this in the news, but I need to say it. On the commercial aviation side, the analysts are saying demand is up, backlogs are up, production is up, but there's issues in the supply chain. And that's the same thing we keep hearing over and over. But when they say issues in the supply chain, those issues actually are pointed somewhat to us. This is the smaller suppliers. This is the ones that don't have enough capital or wanting to take risks to keep up with the timelines that they need within that sector. So there are some concerns that we have within our smaller firms within the state. When you go over to general aviation, it again sounds like a broken record. Every year, you look at the analysts, they say next year is going to be better, and here is why. This is like dating apps or dating websites. There's a new one, farmers.com or whatever. They're always coming out. There's something new, but I'm not sure. This last time they're saying the used business jets are depleting, and that means there's going to be more demand for business jets. Now, I want to put this in context. Right now, our model is going to take what has happened recently and is going to continue to have that going forward. So there's some of that control in there. If for some reason that this next year really is the year for both commercial and general aviation to add jobs, I do not have that captured in the model. And there could be a much more positive outlook on aerospace than what we have. But right now, I'm not really seeing anything that would say that's going to be anything significantly changing our forecast over the next few months. And I hope I'm wrong on that one. Now I added in wages. So the gold bars is the annual average wage in 2016, and those hollowed out ones is the percent change over the last 5 years annually of the growth in wages. Now I want you to use some imagination. Inflation over this time period has been around 1.3%, so draw a little line down there, and you'll notice the downward pressure in the transportation equipment. We're trying to get rid of some of those costs here. We're trying to get rid of costs in for some of the production workers, some of the middle management, and we're outsourcing some of that really high-skilled ones as contract workers. So that's bringing some of those wages down over this time period. When you look beyond that, there's two really good stories here. The first one is food manufacturing, and the other one is chemicals, and they're different. In the food manufacturing, that is bakeries, that's meat processing, which is improving again recently, and animal food processing that we have in the state, right? What is the demand there? It has been, we need lots more low-skilled, but they're actually starting to need some more moderate-skilled because of more technology that's going into them. So they're expanding and looking good, and honestly, with the U.S. consumer looking really healthy and incomes growing, I don't see this one really going away. I think there's lots of parts around the state that's going to improve. Those micropolitan areas are going to improve because they're connected to this farm or the food manufacturing side. On the chemicals, we have a part of this sector that's been a good history and fabric of this state, the byproducts of oils. But we also have this emerging component of it, which is this animal bioscience, and we also have pharmaceuticals. So we had a few companies that do some expansion in not only animal and also human pharmaceuticals. Well, what's happening there because of that? They're getting higher skilled labor coming in and is growing. It's a smaller part of our overall manufacturing portfolio, but it's growing. Some interesting things going on there. What's going on in the more near term, the most recent time period that we had when we pulled this together, and unfortunately there's a lot of red. And part of that red in that transportation equipment, I'll throw in the wages, is that supply chain. It's not the larger aerospace companies, it's that supply chain, it's those smaller firms. We hear positive news about mergers and stuff like that going on with them, but there are issues within there that we need to address. Things I've talked about for several years, but we need to address that. This morning I wasn't going to talk about that, but we talked about foreign direct investment. There's a great study I just read, a good one that's being published, and it's talking about foreign direct investment and where that foreign direct investment follows. It follows where there's already existing clusters. So we could attract more foreign direct investment in this segment. The question is there a need of money or in cash? The question is more, what are those needs with those companies there? And we need to spend a little bit more time in understanding them and helping them with those resources, because they could be producing more. They could be, because there's demand on the commercial aviation side, but something's happening in that system. The other two, I think is fascinating. Again, food. Food manufacturing is accelerating and wages are going up. This is a sign, because of that growth, that is very tight labor market in that low skilled. There's not enough bodies out there. And this is the price signal saying, come in, move in, I'll hire you, we want to do it. At some point, we're not going to be as competitive. Joe made a comment, you're competing against other states. It's not just the incentive side, it's also on the labor cost side, right? And if we keep going up, then it's going to go to Texas. It's going to go somewhere else that can do it and get that labor behind there. On the chemical side, it's going up. I'm not too concerned of being necessarily too tight. This is just an attraction of some of that labor within this segment, which is a good news right there. All right, let me switch. I've been talking about employment, which is good. Most of us want to know about employment. It's easy to understand. It kind of gives a perspective. But really, output gives us an idea of what's really being produced and how they are growing. And you talk about aerospace, now shown by other transportation equipment, really in this state. Aerospace is declining on the employment side, but over the last 5 years, they've been growing annually, averaged, about 1%, right? Not only are they declining, they're getting more and more productive with the value that they're producing. They had some significant changes in the use of labor. They fixed it, they're moving forward, and they're expanding, just not very fast. The recent growth of that 33% is not really, don't get too excited about this. This is just up and downs from previous years. There's a lot of volatility to it. Don't think that we're really accelerating all of a sudden, but they are improving. Business jets have been. When you look down, what's the bigger perspective? Most of the manufacturing, you can tell, have been growing the last 5 years. They've been expanding. And they've been expanding in the most recent year that we have available in 2015. If you go on, and we'll get 16 data pretty soon by industry, unfortunately, it's probably going to slow that growth down a little bit in the state, because overall GDP in 16 in Kansas looked pretty flat. However, I think 17 is going to improve, and I think 18 is going to improve. So businesses, again, are looking better and better. Manufacturing's feeling better because the U.S. consumer, there's looking positive, but my outlook is not necessarily that way. Definitely not aligned. Annual survey asked about businesses and their concerns at the state level, and this looks almost exactly like it was last year. They keep telling us businesses are desperate. I mean, they're at this point desperate for some normalcy, for some regular expectations of what taxes might be. Now, it doesn't matter. It's on both sides of the political aisle that keep saying this. They don't have a problem with changes. They just want to have an environment where it's not volatile and always talking about it and always changing. This is continuing to squelch some of the animal spirits, as Joe was saying. This is squelching some of those animal spirits that's in the state of wanting to make more investments. All right, let's talk about the concerns at local economies across the state. And on here you have labor. And although we hear labor, both Joe and now Carolyn talking about this availability of labor, let me put this in context and repeat what I've said each year the last few years. You back up 5 years, 6 years ago, I came and told you, I said, look, firms are coming to me and they're saying they want to hire, but they're going to be very selective. They're going to just hire when they want to hire. The very next year they said they went from being selective to all of a sudden saying, oh my goodness, we ran out of labor really quickly in the state. And we can't find high-skilled and low-skilled labor. And that's been the last couple of years. Last year and the year before, I started saying, well, we're already past that. We're now hiring marginal workers, workers we did not want to hire. We're doing training. We're hiring people with criminal records. And that's been the way we've been fueling some of this growth the last 2 years. Now, this last year, I went around, and I found it very interesting when I talked to a lot of the firms, and they said, you know, I would hire a marginal worker. I would be happy to pay whatever it took to train them if there was one available. So although they're talking about available labor issues at the national level, we're above that cycle, especially because of what happened in population. We're past that. We're in a very different environment than what they're saying about what's going on in the labor market. We are out of labor, and we need to figure out. And they made comments about job openings. So nationally, not just manufacturing, every time there's been a job opening, there's been actually the same number of job hires. There's been an overall labor matching at the broader U.S. economy, issues within manufacturing, which we're similar to. But here, there are job openings. We're just not getting them into it. Even though wages are going up, we're still not getting them in there. So there's some fundamental issues there. So what's our bigger picture for manufacturing? Our bigger outlook for manufacturing is, well, they're going to grow. They're going to feel better. They're going to continue to grow. How much of that is going to materialize in output, I think is going to happen. How much is that going to materialize in employment? That's my concern. And that's also that underlying thread where maybe those same manufacturing companies will start thinking about not expanding here, but they'll expand just outside of the state or somewhere else so they can be close to their core manufacturing. I see a lot of weaknesses beyond that. So with that, I'm going to turn over to our panel discussion. And this time I'm going to turn to both Jared and Tim. Can you give us a little bit of a perspective of your own company? Tell us a little bit about it. And also make it a little bit of a short expectations. How do you see the economy in general? Because we're going to come back and talk about the economy again in the next question or two.
Sure. Thank you, Jeremy. I'm CEO of Vermillion Incorporated. We're a small business in Wichita, South Wichita. We have 70 employees. We manufacture electrical bulk cable, wire harnesses, cable assemblies for the aerospace and defense industry. Primarily, our revenues are generated in the defense industry. We have seen some growth in commercial revenue through some lean initiatives that we've recently put in place. The economy, as we see it, for commercial and defense is growing, but we're calling it a controlled optimism because, one, we've seen some increase in production of wide-body aircraft. Recently, there was an announcement by Airbus about additional capacity that they have to produce more wide-body aircraft. And we see that flowing down to Wichita and some of our smaller manufacturers, even in Wichita, as long as we can support that growth. The defense budget is another optimistic area where we're projecting growth. There's a lot of talk about growth. There's some political risk, and we have to understand that to make sure that that optimism comes to fruition.
Very good. Go ahead, Tim.
Great. Tim Penner, CEO of Harper Industries. We're located in Harper, about an hour south and west of here. We formed Harper Industries in 1998. My staff and I purchased the assets of Dewey's Manufacturing, which was a hay handling and hay processing company. And since the inception of Harper Industries, we've grown low double digits each year, and so we've had a good run of growth. And one of the interesting things about us is that even though we're in agriculture, we're slightly less than half, which is very similar to what the Kansas economy is. The Kansas overall economy is a little bit less than half agriculture, and the other sectors that we work in are turf equipment, sports fields, golf courses, golf course equipment, and then we also do commercial truck hydraulics. And we do this diversification primarily in order to smooth out the ebbs and flows of business, because obviously, as we've talked about, agriculture and some of the other sectors have ups and downs, and we really want to maintain an even employment for all of our folks in Harper. And so we employ about 100 people, and I would say going forward, we're optimistic. Although this year basically was flat from last year. Actually, a little bit after the election, we got a bit of the Trump bump, and we were showing some pretty good numbers, but since that time, it is slowed down just a bit.
Very good. So, Carolyn, let me go to you. You've talked a little bit about the shift in the needs of skills within manufacturing. And you showed a slide, but I think there's a little bit more you might share what the Manufacturing Institute could say. And I bring that back because I think that's valuable to a very manufacturing-related state and town. So,
Sure,
so tell us a little bit more about the issues behind that and what the Institute can do.
Sure. Well, I mean, it used to be that schools did what schools did and companies got what they needed, and that was that. And we're not there anymore. And there really needs to be a better and more robust conversation at all levels. There needs to be an engagement of the K through 12 schools and the secondary schools, as well as the business community together to help build those relationships so that the schools are teaching and training to what companies need, but that the companies are also making sure that they're sharing that information so that they can actually have those low-skilled, medium-skilled, and high-skilled workers have the base of what they need coming into the workforce. So we do a number of things. We have a group called the Education Council. Actually, the president of the Kansas Board of Regents, Blake Flanders, is part of this group. And it's really a convening because we need to have those discussions. Different states are better at it than others. I know there is activity already on the Kansas level. Other states, there's not as much. And so really, it's the how do we bring together, and then how do you take what works in one state and replicate it and modify it to work in another. And so we've been part of those conversations. But part of it also is the certifications. And we've spent a lot of time at the Institute over the last 5-8 years on certifications. And actually, Kansas has been a leader here in this area with 10 times as many credentials offered or received in the last 5 years. But it's more than that. We need to make companies aware of what those certifications and credentials are so that they're looking for it. We can't just have the supply, we need the demand from the employers. But it's working with groups like that here in Wichita, the National Center of Aviation Training, which is a great model of a partnership with schools and companies really coming together to talk about what the industry needs. And I think stepping back and looking at the larger picture helps you understand that it's not just a problem that Kansas is facing, but that there's a larger national conversation which then could help bring about other solutions and other unique solutions. So, and we can help foster those conversations.
So 10 times more credentials in Kansas, is that correct?
Yep, 10 times as many credentials in the last 5 years as the previous.
So one thing is we've looked at the skilled within the production workers here. We have a higher concentration of skilled production workers in the state and this region. So some of that is because of the type of labor we need probably, but that's still sounds like a pretty impressive number. So.
I mean, part of this whole thing has to be that we have to change the perception, right? And so the average income for a manufacturing worker in Kansas in 2015, which is the most recent data, is $68,775. And so when you talk about the fact that you have a benefit, and Tom talked about this before, about lower cost of living in more rural areas, but then also you layer in benefits and the rest, this is a good news story. But if we don't change the perception, people can't find that part of it out.
Tim, why don't we go ahead?
I just wanted to follow up on this comment that Carolyn made, and it really resonates with us because oftentimes what happens in the place where we're at is that the folks, the students, have this idea that they're going to transition or eventually become, this professional and probably live outside of Harper County. And one of the things that we're working on, and we have this program that we started 2 years ago, and not just us, but the local schools. It's called Transition to Careers. And this has been very exciting. They've hired a full-time person, and they carry on a whole number of events to basically emphasize the manufacturing piece and to say, hey, you know what, it's a good thing to go into manufacturing. And one of the challenges that we've had is people who, leave the community and don't come back. And some of the people we try to attract to the community, and then they say after maybe 3 or 5 years of a good, run, well, we want to go home. Well, what we really need to do is foster the opportunities for those folks to stay in their locale. I mean, that should be all across Kansas.
Absolutely. And if you talk about that economic growth trajectory, I mean, really how to bend the curve, if you will, it really could be getting and keeping people here, as Tim talked about, and having the awareness of the opportunity and having more people go into the supply chain will let you build more aircraft, which will let you grow the economy, and then the stronger of the state, and then everything just, multiplies from there. So it's really if we can get and keep those high schoolers or those junior high schoolers or those sixth graders to stay when it's their turn, then the cycle continues.
We're doing a manufacturing day event tomorrow.
Which is awesome. I hope more of you are too. I'm not going to call on you, but we want to see more hands up for Manufacturing Day.
So Jared, let me go back to you talking about the economic conditions. You started to talk a little bit about the both military and aerospace, which sounded positive. Do you have some more comments about the strength of those two sectors and how that influences you in the cable industry?
Sure. So, in our industry, we're directly tied to commercial aerospace and the defense industry. Again, we're heavier in defense than we are commercial business, but we're working to diversify that for various reasons. The commercial aerospace market right now is interesting. The demand is high. Through the first 6 months of 2017, air travel was at a 12-year high. So the demand for aircraft from the airlines is going to continue. That can be affected by energy costs and also our ability to produce the aircraft. However, we're seeing air travel continue to be high, and we should see continued demand. Another positive indicator, I always try to stay away from talking about the business jet industry because, as Jeremy mentioned, it seems to never get to what we see positive indicators, then they don't ever really come to fruition. But we have seen through 2016, utilization of business jets is as high as it's been since 2009 or prior to the recession, as well as we're seeing the used sales of business jets increase. Now, the source of optimism for business jets really comes from tax reform. If corporate tax reform occurs, we could see some benefit in the business jet industry from that. As far as the defense market goes, both houses have now come up with their bills and passed them through Congress, and we're at a point now where we need to do reconciliation. Both houses have come up with something between $70 and $80 billion increase to the defense budget. Right now, we're working under a 10-week continuing resolution at the Budget Control Act numbers, and December 8th is the looming deadline to have a budget passed for the increase in the defense budget. So there is optimism based on the numbers we've seen come through both houses of Congress. Now, the political risk is concerning. As we get into reconciliation and then they start needing to fund this budget, the concern is there's talk about the way to do that is to cut domestic programs. And so we're going to see probably some political debate and see something that may influence the budget next year, which could be that we work under a continuing resolution until next year. So overall, we're optimistic. We do believe the defense budget is going to increase. How much and how quickly is really yet to be seen because of our political environment.
So you like Rocket Man?
Yeah.
You don't like Rocket Man. You like the.
That's a tough question, Jeremy. But no, I do not. However, the geopolitical influence.
Tim, let me go to you, and you cover a lot of different sectors from the turf management. Can you give me a broader perspective of what's going on
In turf?
in turf and the other sectors that you're doing in agriculture?
I would say generally, as we've been talking about this morning, the economy is good, and probably the least optimistic that I have, least optimism that I have is in the agricultural sector. We saw really a tremendous bump in 13 and 14 on tillage and planting equipment. We have a joint venture with a company in Germany called Horsch, and we were very optimistic. We had a lot of great growth back 4 or 5 years ago, and that really fell off when the commodity prices went down. We are seeing now this year just a slight uptick in some of the planting and tillage and the whole thing of buying farm equipment. So we have a little bit of optimism there, but as long as the commodity prices continue to be very low, it's going to be difficult to come back. In some of the other sectors, turf, we have had some good growth, and in the export area, we've added some new dealers, distributors overseas, which has been very positive. In the truck equipment industry, that has been a very strong component of our sales, and I would say that it will continue to be fairly strong. I don't see a lot of real great growth there, but it has been strong.
So to kind of summarize these economic conditions, there's some pretty positive still comments, although you're making some more concerns on the agriculture side, but still pretty optimistic. Let me switch over a little bit more to the availability conversation that I've introduced, Joe's introduced, and you have done as well, Carolyn. Let me go to you. With this aging workforce, with the other issues of availability of labor, maybe you can talk a little bit more about veterans and women in the workforce.
Sure, and that seems like an odd segue, but it's really, if you're going to solve the skills gap and the gap in the number of workers available and the number needed, we really need to bring more women into the workforce. Right now in manufacturing, you have about 29% of the manufacturing workforce is comprised of women. That's a problem. It's 50% of the population. We need to bring more women into the sector, which also, as I alluded to before, getting more girls interested at a younger age, but also demonstrating and highlighting the opportunities for women and where women have led in the sector already to help pay it forward and give that role model and mentorship. The Institute has a program that's been hugely successful. We launched about 5 years ago. It's called the Step Ahead Initiative. And this came from another report we did with Deloitte to talk about the gap for women in the sector. And over the last 5 years, we have a national initiative. There's a national gala. It's enormous. I mean, it's amazing. It's pretty much like this, actually. It's, we get the biggest place we could find in DC that's a ballroom, and then, we have an event. But it has touched 300,000 individuals, just having those 600 honorees over the last 5 years. So you've got to bring more women and then girls in to continue, because it's not like with workforce we're ever just going to solve the problem. It's going to be a continual effort. But then another one, and this goes back to what we were talking about before, Tim, how do we keep this military members who are here in Kansas, how do we keep them in Kansas? And how do you get transitioning military into manufacturing jobs? And that's a key initiative for us right now. I was up in Topeka yesterday with my colleague, and we were having an event to talk about a program that we'll be launching in January up at Fort Riley, and that's a training program as soldiers are leaving the military while they are still working in the military, so this will be their duty station. They'll engage in a 10-week program that'll give them some base manufacturing skills to make them more available, because as you mentioned before, Jeremy, there is a kind of a poaching going on within the sector because everyone's fighting for skills as Kansas is in a full employment situation. So how do you attract them? How do you show them then the value of staying in the community? Every manufacturer I've talked to, and we have about 25 who have partnered with us, up in the whole state, but certainly in this portion of the state, who have said to us, we want to keep them here. Well, if you give them the opportunity and you talk to them while they're still here in Kansas, and you can give them the opportunity of that job, what does the pay look like? What is the team that they are joining? And entice them to be part of your mission, because that's really at the core of what manufacturers do. You have a joint mission, you have a team, you have a culture. How do you bring them and attract them and keep them? And how does that help close that skills gap, but then also help the economy?
Tim, you already started talking a little bit about the availability of labor in a rural community in Harper. Do you have any additional thoughts about keeping some, even not just the production workers, but maybe management?
Yeah, absolutely. We work very hard at cultivating, opportunities, and obviously I talked about Manufacturing Day and some of the outreach and some of the work that we're doing with the schools. But when it comes to local people, one of the things that we often talk about with not only teachers, but just leaders in the community to say, hey, who are the next generation leaders for this community, and how can we foster and cultivate a sense of coming back to the community, and what are the opportunities, what are the jobs that they want? And that's something that I think is very crucial for us. One of the things I also want to talk about that's an investment that we're also making, and I think oftentimes we as manufacturers, we can talk about the macro issues, we can talk about what other people do. I think what I need to do oftentimes, what we need to do as a company is say, what can we do in order to make things happen? I think that's really the crux of many of these problems that we face. And one of the things that we've implemented is a whole program of product management and product innovation, and trying to continue to spend more dollars for people going out to talk to potential customers, talk to our current dealers and say, hey, what are the products that we can make for you? How can we continue to help you in the tasks that you have out there? How can we make hard work easier? Because that's how our company was built, and that's how we continue to grow. And we need to invest in those kind of research, product management efforts. And it's been really exciting. And we've got some couple of young guys who are really into this activity, and they're very gifted in that. And I trust it pays off.
All right, well, thank you. Jared, do you have a perspective from more of an urban setting on labor availability?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's going to sound like an echo chamber from a lot of the comments previously made, in that as we, even as a small company, have openings, we are finding it very difficult to find the laborers or employees or candidates, applicants that have the skills we desire. Also, as a small business, because of this shortage of skilled employees that are out there, we're having to fight hard to retain the folks we already have and that we've invested in, because there are larger manufacturers out there that are offering better incentives. And so it's real. We've talked about it a lot every year for the last couple of years, and it's here. It's real, and I'm going to give everyone a perspective. I'm going to age myself because I'm a dreaded millennial. I'm right at the top end. And the environment that I grew up in was that manufacturing was a legacy job for my grandfather and my father, all right? But then the recession hit, and all of a sudden manufacturing really took a hit with that, and those jobs took a hit. And as folks my age and younger in our future working capital or human capital, that's how they perceive manufacturing. And so we're seeing folks not wanting to go into it. And so the work that Carolyn's group's doing, the work that Tim's doing with his region, and then the work that groups like the Wichita Manufacturers Association and other areas here in Wichita are doing is very important. And I think the sense of urgency is now, and it's real, and it's very important that not only manufacturers get involved with making sure we change the perception of manufacturing locally, but also our service industries. Manufacturing is a large part of our local economy, and we need all the support we can get in this. And Joe mentioned, we're not competing with Mexico or Japan and China, and even in electrical wire and cable, believe it or not, that's not my main competitor anymore. It's Florida, it's Texas, it's Alabama, it's states that have already started this process of getting a skilled labor force and then creating a pro-business environment. And so right now, we need skilled laborers. We need to increase that immediately so we can keep the jobs that are available in Wichita.
So let me kind of summarize this portion of this panel discussion. Labor issues are abundant here. I mean, there are labor issues. I like some of the comments that you made, Tim and Jared, about being engaged yourselves, about trying to help cultivate some of that labor. I think that also goes back to some of the infrastructure, and Wichita does have some great infrastructure from Workforce Alliance and our technical colleges is trying to engage through the school system. Matter of fact, I think, Carolyn, you're going to go do some tours today and learn a little bit more. So we've got some exciting things. I don't want to give it a completely negative, but that is a key issue for growth. I mean, it's not demand as much as it is some of this labor, because some of that demand will come back. The business cycles for agriculture will come back. Is really some of that labor is what's important. Maybe you can give me one word or one idea that is the most critical or what might be hindering growth for Tim and Jared. Make it about Kansas, if it's something that's slowing growth, and maybe Carolyn, you can make one comment about that one thing in the national economy is slowing growth, other than labor, since we've already said that.
That's so hard. All right, you guys go first.
I guess what I would say is the word that I would give all of you is be optimistic. I guess partly is that I think from some of the speakers that we've already heard this morning, I mean, we're not necessarily looking at great things happening currently, but there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and I guess I would just say optimism is something that we should continue to talk about and go forward with.
Very good. Optimism, Jared?
I'm going to say innovate. I through one-on-ones with our employees, I always tell them that outside these walls, the world is moving 10 times faster than we are. Wichita sometimes is stuck in its traditions in manufacturing and how we do it, and we really need to innovate to stay competitive.
Right. Well, and their environments help for innovation sometimes, and there's a hunger right now. So you might be surprised. There might be production workers with good ideas across the state. So it's a good point. Carolyn, your one comment that's hindering growth in manufacturing, and then we need to switch over.
Communication and community. You can't do this alone. As Tim pointed out, it has to be many people taking it on themselves, but then together as a larger. That's how we're going to improve some of the situations, and it is a partnership with educators in the business community. But then also communication. We all can't just sit here staring down at our phones, right? We got to talk to people in the broader audience and look up and see what the problems are and then build solutions. We are good at this. We just need to, and that's where the optimism and the innovation come from. But if we don't communicate and collaborate, we're not going to get there. So, I'm hugely optimistic. I think there's a lot of potential, but it's the communication, the collaboration to make these two things a reality.
All right. Well, thank you very much for this panel discussion, and I'd invite Deb to come up.